Welcome to the Plateau of Plato channel, your sanctuary for sleep. Democritus stood before the judges of his native city of Abdera, accused of the insane squandering of the colossal inheritance of his father. While the crowd demanded to deprive him of the right even to a grave in his native land, the old man only smiled mysteriously, clutching in his hands a scroll that was worth more than all the lost talents of gold. The trial took place under the open sky in the main square, where the glowing marble slabs burned the soles of the sandals of the gathered citizens. Hundreds of people crowded in the porticos of the temples, looked out from the balconies, and climbed onto the roofs of the shops to see the fall of a man whose name was once a symbol of unthinkable wealth. In the warm air floated a thick aroma of precious incense mixed with the scent of myrrh and ambergris coming from the clothes of beautiful ladies and noble men gathered in the front row. The golden threads on their chitons flickered in the rays of the sun, creating an aura of fabulous majesty around the harsh tribunal. For every resident of this city, there was no fate more terrible than the one prepared for the philosopher by the stern archons in embroidered robes. Deprivation of the right to burial meant not just oblivion, but the eternal wandering of a shadow along the banks of the gloomy Styx without hope of rest in the abode of Hades. The Greeks believed that the soul of a person whose bones are not committed to their native land with proper rites is doomed to endless suffering and ghostly hunger. The relatives of Democritus stood at a distance, covering their faces with the edges of their cloaks, fearing to share this stigma of the outcasts that fell upon their entire kin. The accuser, a heavy man with a face crimson with anger, pointed a finger at the accused and shouted out the figures of the spent riches. He listed the years spent by Democritus in Ethiopia and distant Persia, calling every journey a theft from the future of his family and the city. The crowd hummed in approval when the judges demanded an answer as to where the 100 talents of pure gold had disappeared, with which temples could have been erected or an entire army equipped. The philosopher kept silent, looking not at his judges, but somewhere through them, as if counting the dust particles dancing in a beam of the scorching midday sun. He was already over 80 years old, and the deep wrinkles on his face seemed carved from the very stone of this square. His gray hair fluttered in the sea wind, and his sunken cheeks betrayed years of hardship spent wandering the sands of Egypt. When the murmur reached its limit, the chief archon restored silence with a blow of his staff and granted the defendant the right of the last word. Democritus slowly reached the bench, leaning on a staff of olive wood, and his figure against the clear sky seemed monumental and motionless. He sat down and began to slowly untie the leather cords of his main work entitled The Great World System. To realize what a long path this child from the richest house has traveled to the edge of the abyss, we must return to those distant times when the story of the great Democritus was just beginning to be written on the golden pages of his noble family. To be a citizen of Abdera in the middle of the 5th century BC meant carrying the weight of 1,000 jokes. You see, in those days, a belief wandered throughout all of Greece that if a person was born on this Thracian shore, a light sea breeze blew through his head instead of thoughts. The Athenians, a people terribly proud of their own wit, sincerely believed that the very air of this place made people narrow-minded and slow, like tortoises on a hot afternoon. However, inside the luxurious halls of a manor belonging to the wealthiest man in the region, a child named Democritus began to listen to the whisper of the wind with a clarity that no powdered capital sage had yet achieved. His father, whom old books call Hegesistratus or Athenocritus, possessed a fortune so great that it allowed him not just to live for his own pleasure, but to host kings with their countless and gluttonous retinues. The family of Democritus belonged to the highest class of local landowners and merchants, and every stone in their house literally cried out of wealth and respect. Little Democritus grew up surrounded by the rarest scrolls and exquisite things that merchants dragged from all ends of the world, hoping to trade them for a good portion of his father's gold. While his venerable neighbors in the market square argued until they were hoarse over the price of dried fish and double-checked the weight of every silver coin, this boy absorbed knowledge that most mortals never even dreamed of in their sleep. The contrast between the reputation of his homeland as a refuge for all kinds of simpletons and his own awakening genius became the first great paradox in his long and remarkably interesting life. Ancient historians, those lovers of arguing over trifles, cannot agree on the exact dates of his birth, but most serious people point to the year 470 BC. If those figures are to be believed, then Democritus was older than the famous Socrates by exactly 1 year, although their paths in life diverged as far as ships sailing in different directions. In the shadow of the huge marble columns of his father's house, the child spent long hours watching the endless play of light and shadow. He did not share the noisy fun of his brothers, whose names were Damasus and Herodotus. These fine fellows were already preparing to continue their father's business, studying sea routes and the intricacies of managing a huge household with an air of importance, as if these were the most vital things under the sun. Democritus, however, preferred total solitude in the furthest corners of the garden, where the scent of blooming olives mixed with that bitter and bracing smell of sea salt that cannot be confused with anything else. He loved to feel with his fingertips the pleasant coolness of statues and the roughness of papyrus sent from distant and mysterious Egypt. Every object in this huge house had its own story, and the boy learned to listen to their quiet voices while the others simply made noise. The huge family inheritance, which would later amount to about 100 talents of gold, already surrounded him then in a dense cocoon of safety and lazy comfort. This sum, by the way, would have been quite enough to maintain an entire military fleet or build a couple of temples that would make the neighbors turn green with envy. For little Democritus, gold was only a boring decoration for much deeper reflections on how this whole game called the world is arranged. In the city of Abdera, where trade flourished so luxuriantly that it drowned out any other interests, the young philosopher was already looking for something eternal, something not subject to time and rust. His father often looked at his strange son with legitimate pride and some quite understandable confusion. After all, the boy could watch for hours, without moving, the chaotic dance of tiny golden dust motes in the beam of the scorching midday sun. In these worthless dust motes, which anyone else would simply brush off their sleeve, the child saw a prototype of that great order that is hidden from the eyes of townspeople eternally rushing about their business. Abdera in those years was a truly wealthy port, a real gateway to Thrace, and the paths of the most diverse and peculiar peoples constantly crossed here. It is worth saying a few words about what a mess was going on in the world then, for politics in those days was not an occupation for the faint of heart. While Democritus peacefully sipped fresh goat milk in the shade of his garden, the big shots in Athens and Sparta were already beginning to look askance at each other. The entire Greek world then resembled a dry haystack ready to ignite from the slightest spark, where every city-state tried to outsmart its neighbor, and the giant shadow of the Persian Empire loomed on the horizon. On one side was the Delian League under the leadership of Athens, who imagined themselves the masters of the sea and did not hesitate to shake coins from all their allies in a row. On the other side, Sparta remained sullenly silent with its Peloponnesian League, where people valued a good spear thrust more than long speeches on the agora. The Persians at that time were like a rich landowner with a very heavy mace. They had already managed to get a licking from the Greeks at Marathon and Salamis, but they still owned half of the known world and possessed such an amount of gold that they could buy all the Greek cities wholesale along with their gods and guts. Abdera, being an important trade hub on the northern coast, was located exactly in the place where the interests of all these serious gentlemen collided. The city was forced to maneuver between powerful Athens, which demanded tribute and loyalty, and Persia, whose borders pushed against Thrace from the east. The father of Democritus, being a man not only fabulously wealthy but also remarkably clever, perfectly understood that in such a mess it was best to have friends in all camps. As the Athenian triremes plowed the sea and Persian satraps collected taxes in Asia Minor, little Democritus continued his observations of nature, completely unconcerned about who exactly was considered the main bully in the Aegean Sea today. The funny fact that the sage was born among people whom the whole world considered complete fools only emphasized the peculiarity of his fate. Democritus learned to see true beauty in the most ordinary manifestations of life, finding grains of wisdom where others saw only a reason for another stupid mockery. His hair, which in deep old age would become white as a cloud, was at that time dark as a southern night, and his eyes burned with that very fire of pure curiosity that would not go out in him even after a century. In the silence of the rich garden, the foundation of that greatest intellectual revolution was being laid. The city of fools meanwhile continued to live its usual, fussy life, trying to please both the Athenian strategists and the Persian nobles, completely unaware that a person was growing up within its walls who would one day take and decompose the entire vast universe into the smallest and completely indivisible particles. The political map was drawn, the troops froze in anticipation of an order, and very soon the very sky over Abdera was to be colored in the colors of Persian banners. But Democritus still believed that the most important battle takes place not on the field of war, but inside a single beam of light, where millions of warriors invisible to the eye lead their endless dance. Just you picture a table so long its far end gets swallowed up by the grey morning mists of Thrace. At the head of it sits a man who truly reckons he is a living god and the sole proprietor of the very sun. This is King Xerxes of Persia being fed by the father of the boy while his army of thousands licks the platters clean. What a strange feast for the whole world is happening in this backwater town called Abdera. When an army shows up at your doorstep capable of drinking a whole river dry at one sitting, you only have two choices. You can either die a hero trying to bolt the front gate, or you can show some common sense and put every fine thing your kin has saved for 100 years right on the table. Hegesistratus, being a practical man with a fair amount of horse sense, chose the second way. Xerxes was heading west with a notion to lick the stubborn Greek towns that had been a thorn in the side of his father Darius. This trek was more than just a war. It was the big dusty East trying to sit down heavy on young and sassy Europe. The king's road went through the northern lands of Thrace, and Abdera became the spot where imperial might shook hands with Greek hospitality. The father of the lad fed that hungry swarm so well that Xerxes felt a rare streak of gratitude. He decided to leave his own personal wise men at the house. These were not just any common loafers, but the finest magicians and priests of Chaldea, ordered by the king to act as schoolteachers for all the youngsters in that generous home. In the shade of the garden the lessons began which every brother and sister of our hero took in according to their own grit. For Damasus and Herodotus, the lessons of these bearded Babylonian sages were just a tiresome and boring chore like the education folks expect for children from decent families. While the priests drew tangled paths of planets in the sand, the older brothers of our hero just yawned and wished they were out trading horses or poking each other with spears. The sisters took these tales of stars as odd Eastern fairy tales to listen to after lunch under the rustling leaves, but nothing more. But for the little fellow these lessons were the kind of event that turns a boy's world upside down for good. While the other children saw only odd old men in gold robes, he sensed they held the keys to the secret back doors of the universe. The Chaldeans brought a hard mathematical truth from the East that left no stone standing in the old Greek myths about cranky gods. The boy soaked up every word while sipping his milk and feeling the world become clear and logical. Our hero was not the first Greek to take a long drink from the deep well of Eastern wisdom. We remember how long before this old Pythagoras spent years in Egypt and Babylon learning the secrets of numbers and harmony. He brought back a belief that the world is built on eternal mathematical laws, and that notion already had time to sink deep roots into the Hellenic soil. Even stern Parmenides of Elia did not miss the influence of ancient traditions while trying to find the unity of being past the fleeting senses. The Greek mind in those days was like a thirsty sponge soaking up geometry from Egypt and the art of counting the stars from the plains of Babylon. Our folks were always reaching out to these ancient fires of culture like pilgrims to shrines. The boy was just luckier than most because he did not have to walk 1,000 miles in dusty sandals to find wisdom. It just knocked on his door and sat down in his garden. He soaked up this knowledge with a greed that marks a true genius from a common student. Evening after evening, as the sun dipped into the blue sea painting the horizon in thick purple tones, he stayed behind with his teachers. He was the only one who did not hurry to a big supper, preferring to listen about the infinite sky. The magicians were plumb amazed by this child whose eyes burned with a smarter look than they ever saw in the fancy court at Susa. While Xerxes marched his army south toward a bitter fate at Salamis, a quiet revolution of the mind was happening in that house in Abdera. The boy learned to read the starry map from secret scrolls left by the king. While the Greek strategists sharpened their bronze spears, a little boy was learning to see the invisible. He began to guess that solid things consist of eternal bases. The Persian army left, but the quiet words of the sages kept ringing in his head. The boy believed the most important battle happened inside a single beam of light where millions of invisible warriors dance. Each moment of this childhood was filled with a hidden prep for that great jump into the unknown which he would make when it was time to choose between a fat inheritance and the harsh light of reason. The most dangerous weapon those Persians left behind in the house of Hegesistratus was not some curved knife forgotten in a hurry, it was the art of calculating eclipses. When little Democritus first saw how dry mathematics could whip the ancient fear of heavenly darkness, he figured the gods of Olympus might as well go on ahead and retire. By the 5th century BC, the East had piled up so much knowledge that the Greek myths looked like nothing more than childish scribbles in the margins of a serious ledger. The Chaldeans did not bring prayers to Abdera, they brought a database that was centuries deep. They already knew about the Saros, which is a tricky cycle of 18 years and 11 days after which solar and lunar eclipses repeat themselves right down to the hour. While the Greeks were busy guessing the future by looking at the insides of sheep, the magicians in the garden of Democritus were working with a sexagesimal system of counting. That is the very reason why our modern hour still has 60 minutes and a circle has 360 degrees. The education of the lad did not start with deep thinking, it started with the hard work of learning foreign tongues. To understand his teachers, Democritus soaked up the old Persian cuneiform and the Aramaic language. Aramaic in those days was something like English for all trade and diplomacy from India all the way to Egypt. The boy learned to tell the difference between cuneiform marks on clay tablets where dry columns held observations of the movement of Venus, which the magicians called Ishtar. The Chaldeans handed him knowledge of the zodiac belt broken into 12 equal parts and taught him how to use a gnomon. That is a vertical pole whose shadow can tell you more than just the time, it helps calculate the days of equinoxes and solstices. For a Greek of that time, it was about the same as owning a pocket computer. You see, the East in this century was already standing firm on its feet regarding medicine and engineering. The magicians told Democritus about how Egyptian doctors sew up wounds and perform trepanning of the skull, while Babylonian architects build such vaults that Athenian builders could not even dream of. The boy learned that the world is not a flat pancake floating in the ocean, it is a complex system where planets move along ellipses, or nearly so, and this movement can be put into a number. The Chaldeans taught him that every substance has its own hidden nature. If the Egyptians did well in the chemistry of dyes and embalming, then the Babylonians were masters of metallurgy. These bits of knowledge were not wrapped in mystery, on the contrary, the magicians demanded from Democritus real precision in his notes and measurements. Democritus quickly caught on to the fact that in the East they had known how to predict river floods by the stars for 500 years and used water clocks called clepsydras to measure time down to the last drop. The Chaldeans showed him infinite rows of numbers and the basics of trigonometry long before the Greeks thought up their own words for it. The boy sipped his goat milk and watched as diagrams were drawn in the sand explaining why the moon shines with reflected sunlight instead of its own. This discovery by Anaxagoras, which was just starting to stir up minds in Athens, was an old truth for the teachers of Democritus, written on dusty tablets back in the days of King Nebuchadnezzar. In the 5th century BC they already understood in the East that sickness is caused by earthly things like bad water or rotten food rather than evil spirits. The magicians taught the boy to watch the symptoms and look for patterns where others saw only the whims of gods. Democritus learned to master not only the language of the conquerors but their logic too, which was sharper than any Persian acanates. He learned about the giant libraries in Nineveh that held knowledge on geography, botany, and mineralogy. They explained to him that the world is huge and diverse, and that on the edges of the earth live folks with completely different customs who still follow the same physical laws of gravity and light. The night cool of the garden in Abdera did not just smell of olives, it smelled of real science. The Chaldean magicians left in the soul of Democritus an understanding that the universe is one giant clockwork mechanism where there is no room for chance. Every movement of a star, every tide of the sea, and every growth of a plant is set by a numerical ratio. The boy learned to see the strict skeleton of mathematics behind the colorful veil of Greek legends. He learned that the stars are not nails in the sky, they are glowing spheres or distant worlds whose size is greater than all the territory of Greece put together. These facts, heavy and hard as basalt, pushed the childish fantasies about gods out of his head. So, under the watch of teachers from a hostile empire, Democritus became the owner of knowledge that made him the most dangerous man in Abdera. He knew the languages spoken by the greatest civilizations of the past and knew how to use tools that turned the chaos of creation into an orderly system. His gaze became cold and calculating like that of a proper Egyptian land surveyor. The lessons of the magicians were coming to an end, but the base of knowledge laid in that garden became the foundation upon which he would soon begin to build his own system of learning that had no equal in the Hellenic world. When Hegesistratus passed on to the next world, a time of great and very businesslike dividing commenced in the house at Abdera. While the elder brothers Damas and Herodotus eagerly sank their teeth into managing the inherited olive groves and counting the merchant ships in the harbor, Democritus simply asked for his portion in hard cash. 100 talents of gold in a traveling bag is the best way to turn the predictable life of a wealthy heir into an endless journey after answers that you cannot buy at any market in the world. You see, 100 talents in those days was not just a large sum, it was capital with which one could fit out an entire naval fleet and still have enough left for a decent feast for all the sailors. But our hero had no pull at all toward commanding ships or arguing with tenants about the price of the harvest. In the family study of Hegesistratus, where it still smelled of old wax and expensive wine, a division took place that the neighbors discussed for years afterward. The brothers, being practical men with their feet planted firmly on the ground, looked at the youngest with a poorly hidden sense of relief. To them, Democritus had always been a strange fellow who spent too much time with Persian magicians and too little in the market stalls. Damas got the fertile lands and the stone walls of the ancestral nest, Herodotus took the business and the established links with the merchants, and Democritus received what was considered the most unreliable investment in Abdera, which is ready cash. He had no intention at all of becoming a penniless philosopher or acting like a saint. Democritus was a young man with a very clear mind and an even clearer desire to see everything the Chaldeans had told him about. He wanted to feel the hot sand of Egypt under his sandals, to see the grandeur of the Babylonian walls, and to understand how folks live where the sun beats down harder than in his native Thrace. For him, gold was not an end but simply a very handy tool for getting around. He understood that in foreign lands nobody would look at his noble birth, but everyone would willingly bow before the shine of minted metal. The brothers figured they had made an excellent bargain, as they kept the real assets that bring in an income while they handed the dreamer a sum that is easily squandered. They could not even imagine that Democritus felt like the richest man in the world at that very moment. While the servants were loading the heavy leather bags onto the mules, the youth said goodbye to his home without a single drop of regret. He was not scared by the prospect of spending every last drachma, for he believed that impressions and knowledge are the only assets that will not burn up in a fire and will not go to the bottom with a ship during a storm. Abdera saw him off with the usual noise of the port and the cries of seagulls. The city went on living its bustling life, while Democritus was already picturing the ruins of ancient civilizations and libraries full of scrolls. He did not go around loudly declaring that he was searching for the truth, he simply wanted to test his theories in practice. His travel bag was stuffed with gold, but his head was stuffed with questions that weighed a good deal more. He deliberately chose the path of a wanderer, leaving behind comfort and status for the sake of the dust of foreign roads and the chance to talk with wise men from all over the world. His departure was no flight, it was the calculated start of a grand project. Democritus understood that life is too short to spend it counting bags of grain in the same old port. The first steps outside the gates of Abdera came easy to him. The smell of sea salt mixed with the scent of freedom, and the clinking of gold coins in the bag on the side of the mule rhythmically marked the beginning of his new life. He did not know yet that he would return to this city many years later as a completely different man, but even then he was firmly resolved not to come back until he found at least one scientific explanation for how this giant machine called the world is put together. So ended his youth in the golden cage of his father estate. Before him lay the road leading to Egypt, Persia, and beyond, to where the myths end and the hard logic of facts begins. The young heir from the city of Abdera went out into the world, having enough money with him to buy half of Thrace, but wanting only one thing, to see what is hidden from the eyes of the ever-hurrying merchants. The most expensive and fundamental education in the 5th century BC was not found in the schools of Athens with their endless arguments, it was found in the silent temples of Heliopolis and Memphis. Democritus paid for his lessons with the Egyptian hieroglyphs in the pure gold of his father, but in return he received knowledge of how the human body is truly built and how to measure the distance to the very horizon right down to a cubit. He spent 5 whole years in the valley of the Nile, becoming one of the few chosen Greeks, alongside Thales, Pythagoras, and later Plato, who dared to seriously storm the fortress of Egyptian geometry. It was here, among colossi that had stood for thousands of years, that this matured and strengthened man finally understood the main truth of his future teaching. Behind the chaos of visible forms, behind the changing color of the sky and the fickle rush of a river wave, there always hides a strict and unyielding mathematical order. At that time, Egypt was under the rule of the Persian Achaemenid Empire. This was the period of the 27th dynasty when the country was ruled by great kings like Xerxes or Artaxerxes. The status of a foreigner here was a double-edged thing. On one hand, the Persians brought their laws, on the other hand, the Egyptians still considered the Greeks to be noisy barbarians, even if they were very useful for trade and military service as mercenaries. Democritus was no longer that curious teenager from Abdera, he acted like a serious researcher who needed letters of recommendation, knowledge of protocol, and of course heavy purses filled with coins. The teaching was done mostly in the Demotic script, which was the common language of the time, but for deep scientific truths the hieroglyphs forced him to learn the sacred hieroglyphs. This was the language of the gods in which the papyri from the times of the pyramid building were written. You see, the Egyptians were practical people to the highest degree, and their science was soaked in the sweat of farmers and officials. While the Greeks were just starting to philosophize about the nature of matter, the Egyptians were already using geometry as a tool for survival. Every year the Nile carefully washed away all boundary marks, turning the valley into a monotonous swamp, and the priests had to carve out the land all over again so the treasury would not lose a single debon of taxes. Democritus spent hours watching the work of the Harped and Apti, those special priest surveyors whose name literally meant rope stretchers. These men used knotted cords to create perfect right angles on the sand and calculated the areas of triangles as easily as if they were reading an open book. Democritus quickly realized that Egyptian wisdom stands on two pillars, the sharp needle of a surgeon and the iron logic of a builder. While Hellenic healers were still muttering spells over a wound, the Egyptians operated with knowledge from ancient surgical papyri. The men studied anatomy by the method of the embalmers, learning how the internal organs are placed and how the blood pulses, which the Egyptians considered the main carrier of life force. They opened to him the basics of pharmacology, and he wrote down recipes made from poisonous plants, minerals, and even animal waste products, understanding that chemistry is not magic but the precise mixing of elements. Socially, the Egypt of that time was like a huge anthill frozen in stone. While Democritus studied the calculation of volumes of truncated pyramids and the area of a circle in the temples, life boiled outside the walls. The Fellahin peasants bent their backs in the fields, and the Persian officials scrupulously recorded every basket of grain. The Greeks lived mostly in the trading city of Naucratis, but Democritus, thanks to his gold and persistence, climbed much deeper into the very heart of the priestly caste. He learned that the number pi is not just an abstract idea but a concrete ratio that allows for the raising of domes and the calculation of the curves of canals. The heat in Memphis was such that it felt as if time itself was melting. In this thick silence of the temple halls, Democritus mastered the basics of astronomy. He learned that the calendar of 365 days is the result of thousands of years of watching the star Sirius. Democritus began to suspect that if the stars obey numbers, then everything else in this world, from human thought to the structure of stone, must also have its own inner measure. He spent these 5 years soaking up the smell of ancient papyrus, damp river silt, and bitter medicinal herbs. Egypt taught him patience and precision. When Democritus finally decided that the Nile Valley had given him all it could, he was no longer that enthusiastic youth. In his eyes there appeared the icy calmness of a researcher who knows that gods are only metaphors for describing physical laws. He ordered the drivers to get ready for the journey. His path lay further through the dusty roads of the Levant to the very heart of Mesopotamia, where the majestic Babylon waited between the Tigris and the Euphrates. Babylon greeted Democritus not only with the scent of dates but with a deep sense of recognition. Those lessons he had received as a child from the captive magicians in the garden of his father finally took on flesh and blood here in the heart of Mesopotamia. This was not an introduction to a new science, it was the return of a master to his own blueprints. The man discovered that those scraps of knowledge about the movement of the planets which he had memorized as a lad were but a drop in the bottomless sea of the Babylonian archives. Now, possessing gold and the status of a serious researcher, he could sit for hours in the very same libraries from which his childhood teachers had once gone into exile and perfect his technique of calculation to unthinkable limits. The most imposing sight in the city was Etemenanke, that very ziggurat which became famous in history as the Tower of Babel. You see, a ziggurat is not just a stepped pyramid, it was a staircase between earth and heaven built from millions of bricks. The original tower was begun as far back as the 2nd millennium BC, but the version Democritus saw in the 5th century had been rebuilt by Nebuchadnezzar a couple of centuries before the arrival of the Greek. Contrary to the legends, the tower in the time of Democritus was not a heap of ruins at all, it stood in all its frightening majesty with 7 steps and 7 colors of glaze reaching into the clouds to a height of 90 meters. For a Greek this was a sight surpassing everything he had seen in Hellas or even in Egypt. To help you understand the scale, the famous Parthenon in Athens has a height of only about 13 meters. The Babylonian ziggurat was nearly 7 times higher than the main Greek sanctuary. This was not just a building but a man-made mountain, and for our hero it served not as a temple but as the best observatory one could possibly imagine. Democritus spent nights on the upper tiers of this colossus where the air was cleaner and the stars were brighter. His childhood teachers had taught him the basics of the sexagesimal system, but here he encountered its highest level of mastery. The Chaldeans showed him how to divide a circle into 360 degrees and how to calculate the cycles of Venus with an error of only a few minutes. He understood that the knowledge he had soaked up in Abdera was only a preface to the huge book of Babylonian astronomy. While the Persian officials collected taxes, Democritus along with the priests collected a tribute from eternity itself, entering into his tables data that had been gathered within these walls for centuries. Socially, Babylon in the 5th century BC was the intellectual headquarters of the Achaemenid Empire. There was none of the frozen silence of Egypt here. The city hummed with the arguments of scholars, engineers, and merchants. Democritus, dressed in a good Mesopotamian cloak over his Egyptian linen, no longer felt like a stranger. His status as a man familiar with the Chaldean tradition from the cradle opened doors for him that were closed to ordinary Greek tourists. His attendants could hardly keep up with changing the lamps while he compared his youthful notes with the ancient cuneiform originals, discovering in them a mathematical harmony that would make the head of an ordinary man spin. It is interesting that Babylon at that time was much closer to a modern metropolis than any Greek city-state. They used bitumen, a natural resin, for paving roads and building walls, creating waterproof structures that stood for centuries. Democritus studied the arrangement of canals and locks, marveling at how men had subdued the great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. His Thracian slave could hardly keep up with bringing fresh clay tablets on which Democritus scratched his observations with a stylus. He learned to see the world as a system of cycles nested within one another where the infinity of space is balanced by the infinity of time. Life in the shadow of the great ziggurat required of him not only mental effort but also getting used to the local customs. Democritus quickly mastered the taste of Mesopotamian beer which they drank here through special long tubes so as not to swallow the sediment from the bottom of the vessel. He looked at the ornaments on the Ishtar gate, the blue lions and dragons, seeing in them not divine beings but symbols of those very heavenly forces that he now knew how to calculate. His gold was melting away, but he did not regret a single drachma, understanding that in Babylon he was buying not just information but the very architecture of the universe. When after a few years Democritus decided to move further east, he took with him more than just astronomical tables. In his mind the idea finally crystallized that the universe is one huge and perfectly working clockwork mechanism. He stopped fearing the night because he now knew the path of every star and understood that behind their movement stands no anger or mercy of anyone, only the flawless logic of numbers. His caravan, loaded with priceless knowledge, slowly pulled toward the Iranian plateau to meet new mysteries that awaited him beyond the horizon in mysterious India. You see, reaching India in the 5th century BC was much like flying to Mars today, only without a spacesuit and with mules instead of a rocket. Democritus passed through the scorching sands and the icy passes of the Hindu Kush not for the sake of spices, but for a meeting with philosophers who claimed that the world consists of an infinite multitude of invisible particles. Here, on the eastern borders of the Persian satrapy of Gandhara, in the dusty and noisy city of Taxila, his Greek logic collided with mathematics that did not just count sheep but dissected infinity itself. The path through the Khyber Pass turned our hero into a man who had forgotten how to be surprised by hardships. His caravan had thinned out considerably, and of his attendants only 2 of the hardiest slaves remained, looking at their master as if he were a madman. The man exchanged his thick clothing for a simple cotton dhoti, an Indian wrap which was the only way not to boil alive in the local climate. India of that time built its cities of wood and fired brick, creating huge multi-story palaces with carved balconies that seemed to the Greek the height of architectural flightiness until he understood how precisely the Indian architects calculated the load on every beam. The main fact of the stay of Democritus in India was his discussion with the gymnosophists, those naked wise men from the Vaisheshika school. These people possessed a mathematical apparatus that would make the brain of any European boil. They were already using the concept of shunya, the void, which would later become zero. While the Greeks struggled over how to measure a segment, the Indians calculated the paramanu, the smallest indivisible particles of matter. The sages explained to Democritus that these atoms possess different properties, some cling to one another creating solid earth, others, smooth and slippery, form water. This was physics in its pure form, stripped of divine interference. The architecture of India at that time amazed Democritus with its geometric complexity based on the Shulba Sutras, the ancient rules of the court created centuries before his birth. He carefully studied the arrangement of ritual altars which required almost impossible precision from the builders. According to Vedic prescriptions, altars of different shapes, round, square, or in the shape of a falcon, had to have absolutely equal areas. Democritus saw how the priest engineers used sophisticated algorithms for the squaring of the circle, turning one figure into another while keeping the capacity the same. This was not a rough sketch, it was a mathematical discipline where the radius of a circle was calculated through complex fractional coefficients giving striking accuracy. Even the ornaments on the wooden friezes of the palaces, those infinite interlacings of geometric knots and symmetrical triangles, were for him visual proof that any complex structure is built from small repeating elements according to strict formulas. Socially, India in the 5th century BC was a place where the status of a man was determined by his ability to argue about the eternal rather than the amount of gold in his chests. Democritus observed a rigid system of varnas where the Brahmins stood above kings simply because they knew the sacred texts and the laws of matter. His remaining talents melted away fast here, as gold went to bribing temple scribes to let him read the rarest sutras written on palm leaves. He entered into his travel notes the Indian theories on the conservation of matter, realizing that atoms simply changed their partners in an eternal dance. He returned to Greece as a man who had seen the edge of the world and understood that this edge is just another group of atoms shivering in the infinite void. I came to Athens and no one knew me. This phrase of Democritus would later become a hymn for all true observers to whom truth is dearer than loud applause. While the Athenians were reveling in their golden age, completely failing to notice the thick and gloomy shadow of the approaching Peloponnesian War, a man wandered among them who already firmly knew that both their grand triumphs and their hidden fears consisted of the very same eternal particles. He listened to Anaxagoras and watched Socrates closely from behind the dusty columns of the Athenian porticos, remaining an invisible giant in a city that was used to noticing only those who shouted loudest in the square. There was a special, hidden irony of fate in this, for Democritus arrived in the intellectual capital of the world not as a student seeking crumbs of wisdom, but as an auditor who already held the keys to the entire universe in his travel bags. He settled in the noisy and dirty Piraeus among sailors and fishmongers, where the smell of tar and salty foam was more honest than the exquisite perfumes on the agora. The man whose skin had darkened under the pitiless sun of India and Egypt passed by the shining Parthenon with a slight smile. For him, this temple of fresh Pentelic marble 13 meters high was merely a dainty toy compared to the 90-meter Babylonian ziggurat he had left behind. Democritus intentionally avoided public speaking and did not seek to take a place on the rostrum. He was younger than the famous Anaxagoras by about 40 years, and this distance allowed him to look at the venerable elder with deep respect but without fanaticism. Anaxagoras already claimed back then that the sun was a red-hot metallic mass rather than a deity, and for this the vigilant Athenians nearly took his life. Democritus listened to his talk about the universal mind that orders chaos and understood that the old man had stopped just one step away from the truth. For our hero, no external mind was needed, because atoms themselves did perfectly well at building worlds in the infinite void. On the dusty streets of the city he often saw Socrates, who in those years was in his prime and pestered passers-by with his tricky questions about virtue and justice. Democritus watched these verbal duels from the side, wrapping himself in his modest cloak. It struck him how much time the Greeks spent arguing about human deeds while completely ignoring the physics of the space in which these deeds take place. While Socrates looked for truth inside the human soul, Democritus had already found it in the structure of the very stone they both stepped upon. Wisdom does not need noisy witnesses and the clapping of the crowd to remain an unshakable truth. His life in Athens was simple to the limit and lacked any pomp. He spent the last remains of his gold on the scrolls of those very philosophers whom he watched incognito, comparing their thoughts with his Eastern notes. Democritus looked at the strict geometric patterns on Athenian vases, seeing in these meanders and lines the same mathematical triumph of order he had found in the Indian altars. For him, all the beauty of Greek art was but a special case of the great law of symmetry by which eternal atoms hook onto each other in the void. Athens was the final test for him. He saw that Greek logic is as sharp as a razor, but it lacks that scale of infinity he had soaked up in Babylon and India. When Democritus decided to leave Athens, he did so as quietly as he had appeared. He returned to his native Abdera where his old friend Leucippus was already struggling over the greatest riddle of Greek thought. At that time, philosophers from the Eleatic school claimed that movement is impossible and the world is unchanging and one. Leucippus brought to Democritus the spark of a vague hunch that the world must consist of many small parts. The meeting in the shaded gardens of Thrace around 420 BC became the moment of the birth of atomism. It was a teaching so daring that even 2,000 years later it would seem a dangerous challenge to common sense and the usual order of things. Democritus returned to his native Abdera not merely as a wanderer, but as a man who had seen the mechanisms of eternity itself. His old acquaintance Leucippus was by then already struggling with the greatest riddle of Greek thought. In those times, philosophers from the Eleatic school claimed that motion was impossible and that the world was unchanging and one. Leucippus felt this was a lie, for he saw how water flows and how people grow old. He brought to Democritus the spark of a vague hunch that the world must consist of a multitude of small parts, but he lacked proof and a system. You see, there was a special beauty in this moment. Democritus laid out before Leucippus his Babylonian tables, Egyptian blueprints, and Indian notes on the smallest particles. The man who had passed through the Khyber Pass understood that the intuition of Leucippus was merely a foundation. Democritus began to erect upon it the building of a universal physics. They sat for hours on the shore of the Aegean Sea, watching the waves break against the coast. Leucippus saw in this a tragedy of destruction, while Democritus saw an eternal cycle of elements simply changing their places. One insight gives birth to a spark, but only a rigorous system creates true light. Their collaboration was so close that later even the great Aristotle would have difficulty separating their thoughts. Leucippus proposed the idea that all that exists consists of being and non-being, that is, of the filled and the empty. Democritus, however, filled this abstract scheme with life. He added to it the mathematics of the Shulba Sutras and the precision of the Chaldean priests. The shadow of Leucippus would always stand behind the shoulder of Democritus, reminding us that great ideas are rarely born in solitude. Together they began work on a labor they would call the Great World System. The daily life of the two thinkers in Abdera was soaked in the scent of the salty wind and the dust from old papyri. Democritus, whose gold was melting away before his eyes, spared no expense on new experiments. He studied how a drop of wine dissolves in water and how dust motes dance in a beam of light breaking through the shutters. The man understood that behind the visible stillness lies the fierce motion of millions of invisible entities. His hands, accustomed to the stylus and the compass, were now constantly measuring and weighing something, testing the hunches of Leucippus through harsh practice. The meeting of these two geniuses in a quiet Thracian town became a point of no return for all of Western civilization. While politicians argued over the borders of city-states, Leucippus and Democritus were erasing the borders of matter itself. They realized that if we divide an object into parts, sooner or later we will strike a limit. This limit was their main goal. Democritus felt that he stood on the threshold of a discovery that would make him immortal, even if his body crumbled into those very particles he dreamed of. When the foundations of their theory were laid, Democritus realized he needed visual proof. He required a simple image that could explain the structure of the cosmos even to the most stubborn commoner of Abdera. The man took an ordinary ripe apple in his hands and reflected. If one starts cutting it into pieces, where will the knife stop? This thought experiment, born in conversations with Leucippus, would soon turn into a concept that would outlive empires and gods. The path to the first atom lay through an ordinary fruit and an extraordinary courage of mind. Imagine a grown and seemingly respectable man who sits for hours in the silence of his garden and turns a ripe red apple in his hands as if it were not a fruit but a complex mechanism with a heap of gears inside. To the good neighbors in Abdera this looked like just another purebred eccentricity of a wealthy idler who had spent too much time in the sun. But in truth Democritus at that very moment was performing the greatest autopsy of reality in history without any anesthesia. He suddenly realized that the infinity of dividing matter is simply a clever mathematical trap, and the only way to get out of it is to admit the existence of tiny limits from which everything existing under this sky is woven. You see, if you were to ask a typical Athenian know-it-all whether one could cut an apple forever, he would start up a long drone about the paradoxes of old Zeno. He would say that if you divide an object to infinity, in the end you get a pile of nothing, and if you add up 1,000,000 such nothings, you will not gather a whole apple back together. Democritus sat on his bench, breathing in the thick scent of warmed earth and ripening windfalls, and felt that such logical twists were making the back of his head ache. The man understood that nature is a practical lady and does not stand for such nonsense. If the apple exists, it means it has a foundation that is stronger than any sophistry. He took a knife and steadily drummed it against the wooden table, scaring away the sleepy bees. A cut in half. Then in half again. The blade entered the juicy pulp, leaving drops of sweet juice on the wood. Democritus looked at these scraps and understood that if matter were infinitely divisible, then the world would turn into a shaky mist, lacking weight, taste, and common sense. To save the universe from turning into smoke, he needed to find that very last stop through which the steel of his knife could never pass. True greatness, after all, always shows itself where division meets its last and final limit. In this sultry noon, among the buzzing of insects and the rustle of olive leaves, Democritus finally buried the ideas of infinite divisibility. He brought into use the word atom, which in his tongue meant simply indivisible. This was not some mystical revelation or a whisper from the gods. It was a harsh physical necessity. If we do not want our apple, our garden, and our very selves to crumble into mathematical dust, we must admit that inside everything sit small and very stubborn bricks that do not give a fig about any knives in the world. The man leaned back on the bench and looked at the sun through the leaves. His hands were covered in apple juice, but in his head there reigned the perfect order of an Egyptian pyramid. He realized that the atom is not just a tiny dot, but a guarantee that reality exists at all. This was the very part that was missing in his great world system. Now everything fell into place, the taste of this very apple, the color of the sky over Thrace, and even the foolishness of his neighbors. All of this was merely the result of how these invisible crumbs hook onto each other in the void. The shadow of the absurd that had haunted Greek thought for so long finally retreated. Democritus found a point of support. Now he could explain why stones are hard and water is wet without resorting to tales of moody nymphs or the lightning of Zeus. He looked at the remains of his fruit and saw not just food but a balanced system of eternal and unchanging particles. The path to the first Adam was finished, and this path lay across an ordinary garden bench and an honest refusal to believe in the endless wordiness of the sophists. When the sun began to dip toward the sunset, Democritus gathered his notes. He knew that tomorrow he would have to explain this to Leucippus and the rest of the world. But he had already done the main thing. He had saved reality from vanishing by putting a bold full stop at the end of division. You see, if Democritus had possessed a real microscope in those days, he would likely have been quite disappointed. His imagination painted pictures far more thrilling than the dull gray spots seen by modern men of science. He imagined the atom not merely as a boring and motionless point in space, but as a small, proud, and absolutely immortal individuality. This tiny thing has no color of its own, no sweet taste, nor even the slightest scent, but it does have a very clear and characteristic shape. For our Greek friend, these little ones, invisible to the eye, were the only real currency in the entire universe that never loses its value and never rusts. Imagine the workshop of Democritus in Abdera at the hour when the evening cool begins to cautiously push out the heat of the day. Dust slowly dances in the slanted golden rays of the setting sun breaking through the narrow windows. The man sits at a rough wooden table piled with clay tablets and inscribed scrolls, and he looks at this dust. He understands that before him is not just dirt, but a visual aid on the structure of the cosmos. For him, every atom is a letter of the great alphabet of nature. If you rearrange the letters in a word, you get a completely different meaning, even though the marks themselves remain the same. So it is in his world. The very same atoms, gathered in a different order, create now a grand tragedy of Sophocles, now an ordinary kitchen stool. Democritus introduced the term idea to denote the shape of his atom long before Mr. Plato turned this word into something lofty, misty, and completely unreachable for a normal person. For our practical Greek, an idea was a quite tangible geometric shape of a tiny brick. One atom was perfectly round and smooth, so it rolled like a small ball, creating fire or the human soul. Another was rough and hooked, so it clung tightly to its neighbors, like a troublesome burr on a dog tail, turning into hard iron or cold granite. This whole colorful world was for him only an endless leapfrog of these little entities that simply changed their poses and turns in space. The funniest thing here is that the atoms themselves are absolutely faceless. They have none of the qualities to which we are so accustomed in daily life. An atom of honey is not sweet at all, and an atom of wormwood is not bitter in the least. All these human sensations arise only when a whole army of these invisible fighters clashes with our sense organs. If the atoms are smooth and even, they stroke our tongue, and we blissfully squint from the sweetness. If they are jagged and sharp, they literally tear our taste buds, and we grimace from the bitterness. Shape always determines content, and strict order creates meaning where at first glance utter chaos reigns. Democritus understood that matter is eternal and indestructible. You may burn a tree, and it will turn into gray ash and acrid smoke, but not a single atom will suffer in the process. These little bricks of reality will simply break their temporary bonds and set off in search of new partners for the eternal dance. The shadow of Plato with his mystical ideals had not yet covered Greece, and Democritus enjoyed the pure physics of being. He stripped the world of divine caprice, replacing it with flawless calculation and geometric precision. When the sun finally hid behind the horizon and twilight reigned in the workshop, Democritus put down his stylus. He had created the foundation upon which a building of any height could now be built. But in this perfect picture, one important element was still missing. After all, if atoms are eternal wanderers, they need a place where they can perform their endless maneuvers. Without free space, they would simply freeze into one monolithic and motionless block, devoid of life and any movement. The man realized that it was time to take the most daring step in his career as a philosopher and recognize the existence of that which, in the opinion of all other Greeks, simply cannot be. You see, in ancient Greece, to say out loud that the void actually exists was far more dangerous than confessing to a petty theft from a city temple. The venerable and very serious sages of the Eleatic school had for years hammered one and the same thought into everyone's heads. They said that non-being does not exist, which meant our entire world was packed tight with matter like an oak barrel full of salted herring. But Democritus, that stubborn and mocking Thracian, simply shrugged his shoulders and declared to the whole agora that being exists not a whit more than non-being. For him, the void was not just a dismal absence of something important, but a grand and infinite stage without which not a single atom in the universe, no matter how nimble, could even stir its invisible elbow. Imagine Democritus on a quiet night in Abdera. He stands on his terrace and looks at the bottomless starry sky, where the huge black gaps between the glimmering lights serve as his best visual proof of being right. The cold night air is soaked with the scent of the sea, and the silence around only emphasizes the incredible scale of space. The man understands that if the world were that very monolith of which Parmenides and Zeno spoke, then life would turn into one endless and utterly senseless traffic jam. The freedom of any movement in this cosmos begins exactly where matter finally ends. Democritus came up with two strange words, den and ouden, which in his tongue meant something and nothing. He boldly proclaimed their absolute equality, and this was so revolutionary that even 2 millennia later the palms of some armchair scholars begin to itch at the idea. For him, the void was that very necessary oil in the complex mechanism of the universe which allows the gears of the atoms to rotate forever without grinding each other into fine powder. Without this black and silent space between the stars, our world would be just a dead and motionless lump of granite in which not a single living thought would ever be born. In this dispute with the Eleatics, Democritus showed the true courage of a researcher. If there is no void, it means there is no multitude of separate things, for there would simply be nothing to divide them. The man finally broke the single and frozen being into myriads of tiny fragments that gained the chance to collide, fly apart, and hook together again into whimsical patterns. He legalized the void, making it a full participant in the great construction of reality. The shadow of the great monolith vanished forever, giving way to a dynamic chaos in which alone true life can exist. The daily life of Democritus in this period became even more solitary. He spent hours watching how quickly the shadow from a sundial moves or how a whirlpool of water goes into the sand. The man saw in this not magic but simple mechanics. Atoms flow from one place to another only because space has opened up for them there. Isonomia, or the law of equality, became his main tool. If something can exist in one place, then nothing can reign in another with just as much success. This logical bridge led him straight to the realization of the infinity of all things. When the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky over Thrace in pink, Democritus realized that his revolution was accomplished. He had not just found the bricks of reality, he had found a spacious home for them. Now his picture of the world was complete and stable. However, the recognition of the void gave rise to the next important question. If everything consists of the same faceless atoms in the void, then why do we see such a mad variety of colors and feel such different tastes? The man realized that our perception of the world is only a bright tip of a huge iceberg, hiding the true nature of things behind the veil of our senses. You see, if you had approached Democritus in those distant times and said with all your heart that the apple in your hand is bright red, or that this fresh honey is unbearably sweet, he would only have laughed right in your face with his famous and slightly frightening smile. For our stubborn Greek, Everything that you and I are used to considering unshakable reality was merely a set of colorful labels. Our brain sticks these bright wrappers onto completely gray and absolutely faceless atoms simply so that our lives are not so boring. According to his deep conviction, honey becomes sweet only at the very moment it touches your tongue, and before that moment it is only a pile of round and very smooth particles that do not give a fig about all your culinary delights and poetic metaphors. Imagine early morning in Abdera. Democritus sits on his terrace, breakfasting on simple bread and honey, watching the dawn sun paint the sea in impossible shades of azure. But he analyzes this breakfast not as a gourmet, but as a harsh theoretical physicist. He understands that the sun itself has no color, the sea is not blue, and the bread does not smell so cozy. All these wonderful things are only the result of how an army of invisible might storms his eyes and nostrils. Democritus was the first in history to draw a bold line between truth and opinion. In his words, only in general opinion does color exist, only in opinion are the sweet and the bitter, but in reality throughout the entire universe there exist only atoms and the infinite void. This was the moment of the birth of true scientific skepticism. Democritus divided all knowledge into two unequal parts. One he called dark knowledge, which is everything we receive through our leaky senses such as sight, hearing, and smell. This knowledge always lies, it is subjective and changeable like the weather over the Aegean Sea. And the second knowledge is bright, born of pure reason, which is able to look behind the curtain of this sideshow and see the real mechanism there. Truth is always hidden in the depths, and our senses are only a high threshold that one must step over if you truly want to understand how this world is actually put together. The shadow of solipsism wandered somewhere nearby in those moments, whispering that if the senses cannot be trusted, then the world does not exist at all. But Democritus was too tough a nut for such decadent thoughts. He believed that atoms have their own primary qualities that go nowhere, their shape, their size, and the way they stand in line. And everything else is just our human inventions. Atoms have only geometry, and everything else we finish drawing ourselves in our heads. This was the quietest and the largest scale confiscation of colors from reality in the entire history of mankind. The man looked at his hands and understood that even his own skin is only an illusion of density. In fact, it is a sieve through which myriads of invisible projectiles are constantly flying and into which they strike. His daily life in Abdera was soaked in this realization, as he lived in a world that was at once infinitely complex and frighteningly simple. Shape always determines content, and order creates meaning where at first glance only a riot of sensations reigns. He stripped the world of mysticism but gave it a structure that was stronger than any divine covenant. When breakfast was finished and the sun rose higher, Democritus reflected on the biggest technical riddle of his theory. If the world is an illusion created by the collision of atoms with our senses, then how exactly do these particles manage to get from a distant star or from that same apple to our eye? The man realized that it was time to deal with how our eyes work and create a theory that would explain the mechanics of sight itself. You see, if you had possessed the audacity in those distant times to ask Democritus why it is that you see that old gnarled olive tree on the far hill at all, he would not have wasted time on tales of divine rays of light. He would have declared with the most serious face that this poor olive tree literally sheds its thinnest skin, layer by layer, and these invisible ghosts of things fly through the great void right into your eye. For our stubborn Greek, sight was not at all a passive contemplation of the beauties of nature, but a most real and continuous bombardment. The world is constantly hurling its tiny, shrunken copies at us, which he called idols, simply to somehow declare its existence in this icy infinity. Imagine a hot noon in Abdera. The air above the scorched stones trembles and shimmers, creating a strange haze in which the outlines of distant mountains begin to waver as if they were made of jelly. Democritus sits in the shade of the portico and attentively watches this mess. He understands that since the picture reaches him in such a crumpled form, it means some serious scuffle is happening between his eye and the mountain. For him, the air is not just an empty place but a dense mediator that these flying image idola mercilessly squeeze and stamp on their path, like a heavy seal on soft wax. There was a certain flawless logic in this theory of Democritus, even though it sounds to the modern ear like the raving of a mad hatter. If an atom is too small for us to make it out, then how does it pass information across entire miles? The man decided that things give off a stream of the thinnest films which preserve the shape of the object. And while this flying ghost flies toward you, it fights against the resistance of the air. That is why, when you look at a person from afar, their face turns into an indistinct smudge. It is simply that the air along the way has trimmed the edges of their idol, turning it into a pitiful likeness of the original. We see not the truth at all, but only that crumpled mail which the air, tired on its journey, has deigned to deliver to us. The most interesting part began when Democritus tried to explain the nature of dreams. He believed that these idols of things are so thin and nimble that they can leak through the pores of our skin even when we are fast asleep. They make their way inside and begin to run riot in our consciousness, painting their pictures of distant lands or long-dead people. Sight, hearing, and even dreams, all this was for him the result of one and the same process, a mechanical invasion of foreign atoms into our personal space. Democritus looked at the world as a giant and very complex shadow theater where behind the scenes sit serious and unchanging atoms, while onto the stage of our mind run their flighty and short-lived doubles. He understood that our sight is the most complex way of decoding reality. We never touch the things themselves, we only catch their reflections which bombard our pupils every second. This explanation was devilishly complex for such a simple thing as a look at the sunset, but for Democritus it was the only way to connect the cold void of the cosmos with the hot trembling of the human heart. When the shadows in his garden began to lengthen, Democritus reflected on who exactly receives all these flying messages. If the images of things penetrate us with such persistence, then inside there must be someone who processes them, sorts them, and turns them into our thoughts and feelings. The man realized that it was time to look inside the human being himself and deal with what everyone was used to calling the soul. Being faithful to his theory, he was not going to look for a divine spark there. He was going to find the very same atoms there, only even faster and hotter. You see, for most respectable Greeks, the soul was something like a disembodied ghost, a mysterious shadow, or the sacred breath of the gods themselves, but Democritus looked at this matter much more practically and harshly. He declared for all to hear that your vaunted soul is simply a cloud of the smallest, perfectly round, and incredibly fast atoms that are constantly rushing around inside your mortal body like mad. For him, this was not a mystical gift from Olympus at all, but a most real internal engine that runs on pure and continuous motion. This construction falls into dust at the exact moment when these fiery might stop being held together and fly off in different directions. Imagine a quiet evening in Abdera. Democritus sits by a small campfire and looks intently at the dancing tongues of flame. He feels the warmth of his own skin and understands that life is first and foremost a high temperature and constant displacement. For him, fire and the soul were made of the very same first-class material, of the smoothest and most mobile particles that cannot stand still for a single second. The man committed his most daring theft from the gods as he stripped the human soul of its aura of immortality, but in return he gave it a tangible reality that can be explained with simple geometry and the laws of ordinary collision. In this picture of the world, our consciousness turned into the result of an endless bombardment. Those very same flying idols we spoke of before burst into our body and collide with the fiery atoms of the soul, forcing them to change their trajectories. This is how a thought is born, how anger flares up, and how sadness melts away. Democritus saw no miracle here, only dry mechanics. Death, for him, was simply a mass deportation of atoms from one temporary shell into the infinite void. When breathing stops, the external pressure of the air no longer drives new portions of fiery balls inside, and the old guard of particles simply deserts, returning to the common cauldron of the universe. The most amazing thing is that such materiality of the psyche did not frighten Democritus at all, but rather calmed him. If the soul consists of atoms, then all our fears are also only a temporary configuration of particles that can be changed. The shadow of eternal terror before the underworld vanished forever, giving way to an understanding of a natural physical process. He deprived people of the hope for paradise groves, but in exchange he gave them freedom from the nightmares of Hades. His soul was a part of nature, as honest and understandable as the sea tide or the falling of a ripe fruit from a branch. Democritus understood that since the soul is material, it must be cared for no less carefully than garden tools. Any excessive excitement or violent passion is a real storm in a teacup that makes the atoms of the soul collide too hard, destroying the fine-tuning of our internal mechanism. The man spent hours reflecting on how to keep this precious movement in balance. He searched for a way to make the fiery particles inside us dance smoothly and beautifully without turning into a destructive fire. When the campfire finally burned out, leaving only a handful of gray ash, Democritus rose. He had found the master of our senses and understood how it is put together. Now before him stood the last and perhaps the most important question in his entire long life. If the soul is merely a mechanism and happiness is the correct movement of atoms, then how can a person learn to manage this internal swarm? The man realized that physics must inevitably turn into ethics. The time had come to formulate the rules by which the atoms of our soul can achieve that very blessed calm which he called a good disposition of spirit. Imagine that you are standing on the shore of the sea at night and you realize that our world is only a single grain of sand on the infinite beach of the universe. Democritus believed that in the void there is neither top nor bottom nor center, which means there is not a single reason why life and matter should have concentrated only here. According to his principle of equality, somewhere there beyond the edge of our vision thousands of other lands revolve, upon which two suns may shine or where the eternal twilight of moonless nights may reign. In those times, respectable Greeks imagined the cosmos as a cozy although slightly muddled theatrical set erected by caring but short-tempered gods. Official mythology drew the world as a flat disk carefully surrounded by a turbulent and deep ocean, above which rose a bronze firmament. Across this dome every morning the majestic Helios rode in his golden chariot drawn by a team of 4 winged horses, while under the earth in the damp and gloomy depths of Hades the shadows of the dead crowded together. It was an understandable and domestic picture of the world where thunder rolled because Zeus was angry at some mortal beauty, and storms at sea subsided only when Poseidon put his trident aside. Man in such a universe was no more than a toy in the hands of capricious residents of heaven who could turn him into a tree or a constellation just for fun or out of jealousy. But Democritus, that old fox from Abdera, looked at the stars with that same skeptical squint with which an experienced pilot looks at suspiciously calm water. He stood on a high hill, putting his face to the cold night wind, and in his head the walls of this divine chicken coop were collapsing with a crash. He understood that if space has no boundaries, then matter has no reason to stop at what has been achieved. The man reasoned as if he himself were the architect of this abyss. If in one place atoms were able to accidentally collide and give birth to our olive groves and noisy squares, then it would be the height of egoism and folly to think that a dismal nothingness reigns in the rest of the infinity. He saw in the night sky not the milky tracks of goddesses but the dust from hundreds of other worlds that live their own life completely independent of Olympus. Democritus introduced the concept of isonomia, which in the language of ordinary people meant the law of absolute equality of all points in space. He declared that there is no sacred reason why our earth should be at the center of all being. In his opinion, worlds in the void could be anything at all. Some of them could be huge and flourishing, inhabited by creatures of which we do not even dare to dream. Others could be tiny and barren like dried olive pits. Some of these lands might not have a moon or a sun at all, contenting themselves only with the internal heat of their own depths. And there were such lucky ones that had 3 or 4 bright lights shining in the sky at once, turning every day into an endless feast of light. This cosmic perspective acted on him like a good strong wine that does not cloud the mind but makes it sharp and clear. Democritus completely got rid of that sticky and superstitious fear of death that made his fellow citizens tremble at every clap of thunder. If worlds are constantly being born and dying, colliding with each other in the great silence, then the life of an individual person becomes part of a majestic and eternal rhythm. We are not exiles from paradise and not prisoners of the gods, we are lawful citizens of the boundless cosmos. The man felt a strange and deep liberation in the fact that there was no heavenly overseer above him with a lightning bolt ready. Only eternal motion, only dispassionate atoms, and only the majestic void giving room for the infinite creativity of nature. He looked into the darkness and saw how there beyond the limits of our narrow horizon grand dramas of planetary scale unfold. Democritus realized that our world is only one accidental chapter in the infinite book of the universe, and this thought did not frighten him but filled his soul with calm and quiet pride. When the night shadows began to retreat little by little before the onslaught of the morning dawn, Democritus reflected on the very physical mechanics of this great creation. He felt that behind this process stands a grand rotation, a certain cosmic vortex that sorts the light and the heavy, the hot and the cold. The time had come to figure out how the majestic symmetry of stellar systems is born from the chaotic collision of tiny particles. Imagine that our entire universe was born from one giant sneeze of the cosmos which turned into a swift and inexorable vortex. Democritus believed that in the very beginning there was neither a word nor a divine plan, but only the disorderly movement of an infinite number of particles which at some moment hooked onto each other and began to rotate furiously. In this cosmic carousel, the heavy and clumsy atoms huddled into a dense pile in the very center to become our Earth over time, while the light and fiery crumbs were thrown by centrifugal force to the very edge where they flashed as bright splashes of stars. This was his own version of what modern people would call the Big Bang Theory, only instead of one fiery instant Democritus saw an endless process of matter swirling in giant funnels. He understood that when billions of atoms collide in a cramped space, they begin to push each other like a crowd at a fair, and this inevitably leads to circular motion. You know, if you told some professor from a prestigious university today about this ancient vortex, he would probably choke on his morning coffee in amazement. Just think, this gray-haired Greek, more than 2,000 years before the appearance of huge telescopes and ingenious formulas, thought of things that we are only now beginning to truly realize. Modern science tells us that the universe began with an unimaginably dense and hot state from which everything existing bolted in all directions like frightened horses at the start. And here is such a funny thing, Democritus described exactly the same picture. He claimed that in the beginning there was a certain accumulation of matter in a tight space which under the action of internal pressure and infinite collisions began to expand and swirl. His cosmic vortex, this great dime, worked exactly like those same gravitational forces that gather star dust into huge glowing spirals of galaxies. The sage from Abdera understood that if you give atoms enough space and time, they will on their own, without any magic wands or divine decrees, build all this grand architecture of the sky that we see above our heads. This fascinates me more than the fastest paddle steamer going down a great river in clear weather. Just imagine, a man sits on the threshold of his house in a small town and by the power of his imagination pierces billions of miles of void. He saw how order is born from the chaos of primary collisions. Democritus described how larger and coarser particles, colliding, slow down and settle in the middle, forming the solid ground under our feet. And the smallest, smoothest and hottest atoms, which he called fiery, are pushed outward by the same force of rotation. There, on the periphery of this world whirlpool, they rub against each other with such fierce force that they begin to glow, turning into those very stars and that very sun that gives us life. It is pure physics, my friends, without a drop of superstition or mystical fog. But here lies the main irony of fate for any true thinker. While Democritus watched these majestic processes with the delight of a child, harsh earthly reality was already preparing to teach him its own lesson in gravity. He had plunged so deep into the mechanics of the world vortex that he completely lost sight of another vortex, much more mundane and biting. It was the vortex of human discontent mixed with clinking coins and the legal subtleties of his hometown. You see, there is nothing more constant in this sublunary world than the good old habit of people enthusiastically counting someone else's money and watching with undisguised gloating as it flows through a neighbor's fingers. When Democritus finally settled in his native Abdera after endless and ruinous travels through overseas lands, absolutely nothing remained of his once colossal paternal inheritance of 100 talents. He had no luxurious olive groves, no merchant ships, not even a decent spare chiton, but he did have a huge heap of dusty scrolls and a head filled to the brim with the strangest ideas one can imagine. In the eyes of the respectable and stingy citizens, he instantly turned from an enviable heir into an ordinary and pathetic loser who managed to trade a whole fortune for empty and useless tales of Babylonian magicians or Egyptian priests. Imagine a hot and stuffy noon in the main square of Abdera. The air is saturated with the smell of dried fish, dust, and that very sticky feeling of universal contempt that literally hangs in space. Democritus walks past the wealthy stone houses that by right of birth could have belonged to him, but now he is only a guest supported by his faithful brother Damasus. His old chiton had long since faded in the scorching sun, and his sandals had seen better days, but his gait remained as light as the movement of those very atoms he constantly reflected upon in silence. However, for the local law, his lightness was a grave crime. In those harsh times in Abdera, there existed one single but merciless rule that could deprive a person of everything. Any citizen who through folly or carelessness squandered his father's property was deprived of the sacred right to burial in his native land. This was not just social censure, it was a legal sentence that made a person a stranger among his own. For a Greek of that time, there was no fate more terrible than becoming an outcast even after one's own death. Relatives and neighbors met Democritus not with joyful shouts but with biting taunts that flew at his back at every dusty corner. People competed in wit, wondering on exactly which page of his clever books it was written how one can feed oneself and one family when only the free wind wanders in the larder. He was considered a madman who had blown a whole mountain of gold on talk about the void, and now this very void was insistently knocking on his own doors in the form of an official accusation. Democritus learned on his own skin that public opinion is structured much more rigidly and clumsily than the heaviest and coarsest atoms of the earth. He was forced to live in poverty, supported only by the devotion of Damasus, while informants were already preparing their speeches for the popular assembly. But what is surprising is that the sage himself did not look like a crushed or unhappy man at all. He understood what all these busy merchants and gloomy judges could not grasp. Gold is only a temporary combination of particles that sooner or later will crumble into dust, while true knowledge stays with you forever. The situation required decisive action as the outcome of the upcoming trial seemed foregone to everyone. Democritus understood that simple philosophical calm would now be insufficient to save his honor and the right to the grave of his ancestors. He needed to present to the city something that would weigh much more than all those 100 talents he had so consciously spent on studying the mysteries of the universe in distant lands. In the silence of his brother house, he began to prepare his most important and crushing answer to all the ill-wishers. He was going to bring before the judgment of the people the fruit of his many years of reflection, his great work entitled The Great World System. Little has any mortal seen a trial where a man accused of wasting millions tries to justify himself with a fascinating lecture on the structure of the starry sky. When the chief archon finally struck his heavy staff against the red-hot marble, calling the venerable assembly to silence, a terrifying hush fell over the square. The accuser had just finished listing the talents spent by Democritus with such fierce passion as if they were his own molars pulled out without any anesthesia. To help the esteemed public understand the true scale of this financial disaster, one should stop and explain what that ancient talent actually was. It was not some abstract unit of measurement or a poetic metaphor, but a tangible, monstrously heavy basket of pure gold. One talent weighed about 26 kilograms, and if you wanted to walk through the market with such a wallet, you would need either an athletically built slave or extraordinary strength in your hands. Imagine 100 such golden blocks laid out in a row. It was a fortune with which one could buy up half the city shops, build a private fleet of fast triremes, or hire an army of mercenaries. Democritus had managed to turn this mountain of gold into road dust, foreign dialects, and scrolls with incomprehensible scribbles. In the eyes of a commoner, this was not just extravagance but sheer madness. And now all the eyes of thousands of people were fixed on this gray-haired man who slowly and solemnly untied the leather cords of his scroll as if he were about to release the infinite universe itself. Democritus did not sprinkle ashes on his head or beg for mercy. He sat on the judicial bench, squared his shoulders, and began to read his great world system in a steady and deep voice that surprisingly carried even over the noise of the sea surf. You must understand that before him sat not a dark and illiterate crowd of shepherds, but the true elite of the city. These were people who had studied under the best geometers, men who knew thousands of lines of Homer by heart and understood the complex harmony of musical modes. They had come to punish a spendthrift, but with the very first lines about the void and the eternal motion of atoms, they suddenly turned into spellbound students. The old man described to them how from the primary chaos and collisions of particles invisible to the eye, those very luminaries were born that were now scorching them with their rays. He spoke of the infinity of worlds so convincingly that the walls of their cramped city seemed to move apart, revealing the grandeur of the real cosmos. The silence in the square became so thick that one could hear a stray fly buzzing. When Democritus finished reading, the judges could not come to their senses for a long time. The bowl of the scales on which the wisdom of the great world system lay decisively outweighed everything else. Something unheard of happened. The popular assembly in a single impulse decided not only to completely acquit the philosopher but also to shower him with honors. The city vied to commission copper statues in his honor. A copper statue was the highest mark of quality, an eternal certificate of immortality. But along with this bronze immortality, the heaviest punishment imaginable for a philosopher fell upon the old man's head, universal, suffocating, and utterly unceremonious popular love. Democritus could not take 10 steps through his native Abdera without running into another enthusiastic admirer. He was tortured with questions. Every passing shopkeeper or idle stroller considered it his sacred duty to stop him and start an endless, highbrow conversation about the fates of the universe. Fame was a cage, even if cast from the best copper. The philosopher began to look at the dark openings of old vaults and silent city cemeteries, where the only interlocutors could be the shadows of the past and eternal, blessed silence. Imagine the faces of typical Greek commoners stretched with amazement and sacred horror as they observed the same incredible picture every morning. The most respected man in the city, recently triumphantly acquitted by the court and literally showered with gold coins, suddenly takes his old worn mat, a bundle of scrolls gnawed by time, and slowly goes to live in a gloomy burial cave on the outskirts of the polis. Sinister and juicy rumors immediately began to crawl through respectable Abdera. Neighbors whispered to each other that old Democritus had finally and irrevocably lost his mind from an unbearable excess of wisdom or, even worse, had begun to practice forbidden black magic in the company of disembodied shadows. But for the philosopher himself, this was neither madness nor magic, but a great and long-awaited liberation from the sticky embrace of obsessive popular love. To understand the horror this act instilled in his fellow citizens, one must remember how the Greeks of that time imagined the underworld. For them, a cemetery was not just a place for resting bones, it was a real lobby to the realm of gloomy Hades, filled with ghostly shadows waiting for a chance to drink a drop of living blood or send madness upon a passerby. The fear of the invisible world of shadows was so great that even the bravest warriors tried to pass the necropolis before sunset, fearing to meet wandering spirits or angry Hecate. Among the cold stones of the necropolis and the silent urns with the ashes of ancient ancestors, Democritus finally found that absolute and ringing silence in which alone one can truly hear the thin whisper of nature itself. Here, in the deep shade of centuries-old cypresses, he could spend hours watching tiny dust motes swirl in a single beam of light breaking through a crack in the ceiling of the vault, without fear that some enthusiastic idiot would slap him on the shoulder and ask his authoritative opinion on the prices of olive oil or the latest city gossip. Democritus reasoned with the iron logic of a true automist. Living people are scared to death of the dead and all sorts of ghosts, which means the city cemetery is the only place on all Greek land where a thinker can feel completely safe from annoying know-it-alls and their endless empty disputes. For a man who understood that everything that exists consists of the same eternal particles, there was nothing frightening or unnatural in the grave cold. The sage looked at old bones not as the remains of terrible ghosts, but as a temporary haven for atoms that once played their roles in the great theater of life and now simply returned to the general storehouse of matter. He turned his vault into a real laboratory of silence. While frightened fellow citizens bypassed his new home with superstitious horror, the old man enjoyed the company of shadows, who possessed that rare and priceless quality of never interrupting him mid-sentence. His withdrawal from society was the loudest statement that true greatness of spirit does not need the applause of the crowd. Conducting long nights in the company of silent skulls, he began to notice in their structure not death, but a great harmony of construction. Since the human body was sacred and inviolable, Democritus brought the carcasses of various animals to his secluded dwelling, from ordinary birds to sacrificial goats. He carefully opened them, seeking to understand how tendons are connected and where the mechanism that makes the heart beat is hidden. We are about to peek over the shoulder of the sage to see how the very first anatomical atlases in the history of mankind are born among the graves. Imagine Democritus in his voluntary confinement engaged in a matter so dubious from the point of view of public morality that even modern quacks would consider him an overly obsessive type. He decided that if the world is a complex mechanism, similar to a huge military ballista or an ingenious water clock, then it is absolutely necessary to understand its joints, even if these levers and gears are covered with thick fur and bleat heartrending cries before the very start of the great experiment. His anatomical studies on animals were an act of such transcendental intellectual impudence that the gods on Olympus must have momentarily distracted themselves from their nectar and started placing bets on how soon this old man would finally lose his mind or his conscience. Surrounded by the silent bones of his ancestors, with the tenacity of a true scientific maniac, he drew diagrams of vessels, ligaments, and muscles, proving to the whole world that a living being is not a divine ode at all, but a rather complex and sometimes capricious system that breaks in the most ridiculous way. Of course, it would be the height of naivety to believe that our philosopher was the only person in the sublunary world who decided to engage in a detailed study of animal organs. By the 5th century BC, humanity had already accumulated a considerable baggage of knowledge about what lies beneath the skin, although sometimes this knowledge resembled a collection of scary fairy tales rather than a textbook. In distant Egypt, the masters of embalming had over thousands of years become so skilled at extracting entrails that they could have taken a pharaoh apart for spare parts with their eyes closed and using only a single bronze hook. The Egyptians knew perfectly well where the heart is and what the kidneys look like, but the trouble was that they were more interested in how these organs would behave in the afterlife rather than how they pump blood in this one. In Babylon, the diviner priests reached such heights in inspecting sheep entrails that they could have drawn a detailed map of every fold, if only they had not spent all their time trying to read the will of the gods or the price of barley in the bile ducts. In Greece itself, people did not sit idly by either. The Pythagoreans were already saying that the brain might be something more important than just a sponge for cooling the blood, and doctors from the school of Alcmaeon even tried to trace the path of the optic nerves. However, Democritus brought something completely new to these scattered observations, his theory of atoms. For him, the study of biology was not a search for divine intent or magical forces, but a continuation of physics. He looked at the guts of a sacrificial goat with the same cold interest with which an experienced master examines the parts of a broken cart, trying to understand which axle cracked. He transformed his vault into a real laboratory where carcasses of sheep, pigs, and wild birds were delivered under the cover of night. His instruments were simple but effective: bronze knives, thin bone needles, and piles of papyrus which he covered with small, cramped handwriting. He sketched every heart valve and every convolution of the brain, trying to understand exactly how the smallest atoms hook into complex nodes to form living tissue. You see, if I were the most famous doctor in the sublunary world and received a tearful letter smelling of panic from an entire city with a humble request to treat their chief wealthy man who suddenly moved to a cemetery and began to hold heart-to-heart conversations with sheep kidneys, I would first of all check whether the authors of this message themselves were infected with collective madness. Hippocrates, being a man of the highest degree of seriousness and not at all inclined to idle sea voyages for fun, arrived in Abdera with a full set of the harshest enemas, a supply of bitter herbs, and a firm intention to return old Democritus to the fold of a decent and predictable society. However, when he crossed the threshold of the dark vault and saw with his own eyes what this officially declared madman was actually busy with, he instantly realized that all his medical reference books could be safely used to kindle the fireplace. Before him, among the dust and bones, sat perhaps the only truly sane person in all of Greece. The main symptom that threw the respectable Abderites into a state of quiet fury was not at all the philosopher moved to the necropolis, but his inexhaustible and completely inappropriate laughter. Democritus made it a habit to laugh at things that any normal person considers the height of seriousness. Imagine the picture: a magnificent funeral procession is passing, relatives compete in the loudness of their wails, and our hero sits on the sidelines and bursts out laughing as if he is watching the best comedy of Aristophanes. In those times, the Greek stage knew much about satire, and great authors like the same Aristophanes or Cratinus mercilessly mocked gods and politicians, but their laughter was predictable and safe. The laughter of Democritus was a philosophical sentence. He saw behind the powdered faces and expensive chitons only a temporary accumulation of atoms that tomorrow will fly off in different directions, leaving behind only a handful of dust and a pile of unpaid debts. In our enlightened future, people usually fall into the deepest depression from such thoughts and spend whole fortunes on having the meaning of life returned to them. Modern man, having realized the frailty of being and the insignificance of his efforts on the scale of the universe, is inclined to consider this a tragedy of cosmic proportions. We are used to pitying ourselves, nursing our mental traumas, and seeking consolation in the dark offices of psychoanalysts. Democritus, however, looking into the very same abyss of void and material decay, found in this a reason for endless fun. For him, the pursuit of fame, power, and gold was like a serious game of children in a sandbox, where everyone is sure that his mud pie is an impregnable fortress that will stand forever. The inhabitants of Abdera were frightened to the point of hiccups by this laughter because it devalued their precious fuss. When a person laughs at your sacred sorrow or your great triumph, he steals your sense of self-importance, and this is a sin that the crowd never forgives. They decided that if the sage finds the world funny, then all the screws in his skull have finally become mixed up. You see, if a modern person suddenly realized that they are merely a temporary combination of tiny motes of dust, flying in a bottomless void at the speed of a cannonball, the first thing they would do is rush to make an appointment with the most expensive London shrink or lock themselves in a closet with a year's supply of smelling salts. We are used to considering our life a majestic epic canvas where every scratch we get is a world-scale tragedy worthy of Shakespeare's pen. Democritus, possessing exactly the same knowledge about the finiteness of our stay in this world, for some reason decided that this is the world's best reason for a good, hearty belly shake. His laughter was not a mockery of the unfortunate, but the sincere delight of a spectator who suddenly realized that behind the scenes of the most terrifying theater sits merely a bunch of invisible crumbs playing leapfrog according to the laws of pure chance. Traveling between Greek cities in those blessed times was a slow, majestic, and awfully dusty affair. Rich idlers from Abdera preferred to be carried in palanquins by tall slaves or proudly rode in chariots, raising such clouds of lime that the sun seemed a dull copper bowl. However, Hippocrates, being a man of stern disposition and not prone to cheap effects, most likely made the journey from the harbor to the city outskirts on his own 2 feet or, at most, astride a melancholic donkey. He was accompanied only by a couple of students with leather bags tightly packed with surgical saws and bundles of dried weeds that the Greeks mistakenly called medicines. The roads of Abdera, paved with stone so crookedly as if they had been laid by a drunken satyr, resounded with the cursing of drivers and the creaking of ungreased axles. But the closer the physician got to the city necropolis, the fewer living people he met on his way and the more distinct the smell of real, unscented truth became. Hippocrates used his favorite technique. He decided to just watch the spectacle from the side. He refused hasty diagnoses, deciding first to listen to the patient himself to understand in which direction his mind had jammed. The doctor found the philosopher in the most suitable place for a madman, in the solitude of the cemetery, where he sat on a fragment of marble among piles of inscribed papyrus and skinned animal carcasses. It was there that the famous embarrassment with the milk happened. When a servant brought a bowl, Democritus barely touched the drink with his lips and quite casually remarked that it was the milk of a black goat that had just brought its first kid. Hippocrates froze in place. Such accuracy was available either to the gods or to a person whose nose and tongue worked better than those of a hunting dog. Modern gentlemen in white coats find a completely earthly explanation for this story. In a first-time mother goat, the milk is always thicker and sweeter, full of specific substances. Add to this the fact that black goats heat up more in the sun, changing their water metabolism, and you will understand that Democritus was not guessing. He simply trained his senses into the most precise measuring instrument of his time. When the sun began to tilt toward sunset, painting the marble tombstones of the necropolis the color of a ripe pomegranate, Hippocrates finally rose from his stone. He folded his instruments as slowly and solemnly as if they were sacred relics and headed toward the exit, where a good half of the population of Abdera was already waiting for him. The crowd bubbled like a pot of cheap stew. Every small merchant and every important archon burned with the desire to hear that old Democritus had finally lost his mind and that it was time to lock him up so that he would not embarrass decent people with his inappropriate cheerfulness. They expected prescriptions for pounds of hellebore and advice on expelling evil spirits, but instead, they received a portion of truth that turned out to be much more bitter than any medicine. Hippocrates circled those present with his famous icy gaze, which made migraines vanish from malingerers and knees shake in liars. He did not indulge in polite prefaces but simply announced that in all his extensive practice, he had not met a man more healthy, clear-minded, and profound in his judgments than this madman in a dusty chiton. The great physician stated that Democritus does not laugh at people out of malice or insanity at all, he simply sees the underside of this world, where behind every important face lies only a temporary accumulation of atoms, and behind every great tragedy, an ordinary absurdity. While the townspeople spent their lives accumulating gold and endless squabbles over patches of land, the philosopher studied the eternal laws of nature that would outlive both this city and all its fussy inhabitants. The most crushing blow to the pride of the Abderites was Hippocrates' words that it was not Democritus who needed treatment in this backwater, but every first person who considers the pursuit of ghostly fame a matter of paramount importance. He told these pompous gentlemen directly that their own fear of the truth is the very disease they tried to attribute to the sage. The fact that a person finds the strength to smile in the face of eternal void makes him not a patient but a teacher. A ship for Kos was already waiting in the port, and Hippocrates hurried to take his leave, leaving the city in a state of such deafening astonishment as occurs only after a lightning strike on a clear day. This day became the official triumph of atomism over prejudice. Democritus remained in his garden, surrounded by books and silence, but now no one dared to cross the threshold of his domain with shouts of madness. It was the victory of a mind that does not need the approval of the crowd. There is a legend, carefully passed down by Cicero and Gellius, that in his extreme old age Democritus decided to finally get rid of the intrusive mediation of his own eyes. He directed blinding sunlight onto a polished bronze shield, turning it into a fiery mirror to burn the variegated and false images of the visible world out of his memory for the sake of contemplating the pure logic of atoms. At least, that is how the lovers of high drama like to tell this story, believing that a philosopher is simply obliged to commit something extraordinary before finally retiring. In reality, if we discard the theatrical gestures and bronze shields, old Democritus most likely fell victim to ordinary human diligence and the relentless passage of time. In those blessed days when the only light source after sunset was a smoking oil lamp that gave off more acrid smoke than clear radiance, vision was an extremely fragile and short-lived commodity. Imagine this venerable gentleman who, decade after decade, bent his gray head over endless scrolls of papyrus. His fingers, stained with ink, carefully touched the rough pages while he wrote out his theories about the void and the infinity of worlds. Eyes that once greedily absorbed the colors of Egyptian temples and the dust of Babylonian roads gradually grew tired of the unbearable burden. It is quite likely that there was no heroic act of self-blinding at all. The old man could have simply gone blind from old age and that very strain that inevitably overtakes anyone who tries to discern the structure of the universe through the narrow neck of an inkwell. But for ancient gossipers to admit that a great sage simply lost his sight from senility was too boring and completely unworthy of their talent for exaggeration. Of course, there is no smoke without fire. Democritus was an extremely curious man and never missed a chance to test a theory in practice. It is very possible that neighbors and accidental passers-by more than once found him in the garden engaged in very strange activities. He could spend hours catching sunbeams with a polished bronze disc, studying the laws of reflection and refraction of light. And when years later the philosopher finally stopped distinguishing the outlines of his native Abdera, the respectable public mixed his optical experiments, the old shield, and his blindness into one picturesque pile. For Democritus himself, this confusion in witness testimony was just another reason for that same legendary laughter. Sitting in his eternal shadow, he felt the tactile coolness of the stone and listened to the rustle of leaves, realizing that his mind had finally been freed from the dictatorship of the pupils. This darkness became for him not a prison but a spacious office without walls or a ceiling. The blind sage stood on the threshold of the strangest discovery of his life, preparing to explain to humanity that the gods are not angry judges on the clouds, but only another type of matter obeying the eternal law of motion. Democritus of Abdera never denied the existence of gods in the crude sense that modern atheists do, but he did something much more daring. He deprived the inhabitants of Olympus of their divine immunity by declaring that the thunderer Zeus and the beautiful Aphrodite are just giant clouds of especially thin and hot atoms that drift in the void and eventually crumble into dust just as obediently as an old kitchen stool. Imagine the amazement of an honest Greek who has just given his last drachma to buy a sacrificial goat to appease Poseidon, and then an old man comes out of the shadow of the porticos and informs him that his sea lord is just a very large natural phenomenon. In the understanding of our philosopher, the gods were something like heavenly giants made of pure matter, fiery images that can penetrate the dreams of people or send them sudden forebodings, but are completely incapable of canceling the eternal laws of physics for the sake of someone's tearful prayer. The smell of incense wafting from a distant temple mixed in the air with the bitter aroma of sea salt, creating that very atmosphere of sacred awe that Democritus systematically destroyed with his logical hammer. He believed that people invented formidable gods only out of fear of incomprehensible forces of nature, such as lightning or an eclipse, endowing ordinary atmospheric phenomena with will and bad character. The philosopher saw in the sky only an endless dance of particles where even the most powerful entities obey iron necessity and have no power over human fate. Religion in his hands turned into a kind of meteorology of a higher order, where a god became an interesting but completely natural object of study, deprived of the aura of mystical mystery. Priests probably looked at this blinded researcher with the same feeling with which current owners of fortune-telling salons look at tax inspectors. Democritus argued that the gods are mortal, and although their lifespan can be measured in centuries, the finale for all atoms is the same. Such a picture of the world instantly evaporated any sacred horror, because it is stupid to tremble before a being that is woven from the same bricks as the dust on your sandals. This daring teaching gave people something much more valuable than the hope of afterlife bliss. It gave them freedom from fear. When the heavens cease to be the abode of capricious tyrants and become just part of the material universe, a person can finally lower their eyes from the clouds and look inside themselves. Democritus proclaimed not a heavenly thunderer, but human reason and that very inner balance, which he called Euthymia, as the only true judge and master of life. Realizing the materiality of the divine became a bridge to his main ethical doctrine. Democritus considered Euthymia the highest good and the only worthy meaning of our short stay on this planet. It is a mysterious state of joyful tranquility in which the soul dwells in such deep harmony that neither the fear of the grave cold, nor the whims of the gods, nor the poisonous envy of neighbors can cause even a slight ripple on it. Imagine an early morning in his overgrown garden in Abdera, when the air still smells of night freshness and damp earth. The old philosopher sits on a rough wooden bench, feeling the soft coolness of the grass with his feet and the taste of the first juicy fig, which he slowly breaks with his fingers. For him, this moment is not just breakfast, but a triumph of that very moderation that he preached as the only medicine for the madness of the world. The sound of the distant surf of the Aegean Sea reaches his ears like the measured breathing of the universe, reminding him that everything in this world flows and changes, and only internal balance remains an unshakable rock among the raging waves of human passions. Euthymia in the understanding of our hero had nothing to do with silly delight or drunken fun. It was a state of complacency achieved through deep knowledge of the nature of things. Democritus believed that a sage is one who has learned to rejoice in the smallest grain and does not exhaust himself with fruitless dreams of what does not belong to him. He often repeated to his students that the hopes of educated people are much better than all the gold and silks of the ignorant, because true wealth is hidden not in chests, but in the ability to maintain an internal smile even when fate turns its harshest side to you. While Athenian demagogues tore their chitons in disputes over power, the old man from Abdera practiced the art of proportionality, believing that excess in anything turns life into chaos and deprives a person of the most valuable thing, the silence of the mind. Death in this coordinate system ceased to be a bony old woman with a scythe and became a simple and natural event, the return of the fiery atoms of the soul to the general flow of being. Democritus saw no point in trembling before the end, which is as inevitable as the sunset over the horizon. Such ruthless materialistic logic paradoxically made him the most optimistic person of his time. If after death there is neither judgment, nor torment, nor capricious shadows, then the only way to live the allotted time with dignity is to fill it with the joy of knowledge and kindness to others. He called not to strive for excessive fame, which is as changeable as the wind, but to seek support in one's own conscience and clarity of thinking. This calmness of a person who does not need gods to be happy so strongly hurt the pride of some great minds that they were ready for the most extreme measures. The time was coming for a clash of two worlds, where one great philosopher would decide that the ideas of Democritus were so dangerous they had to be immediately committed to fire along with all his books. Plato hated Democritus's materialism so passionately and sincerely that one day he seriously intended to collect every single manuscript of this laughing old man throughout Greece and arrange a grand educational bonfire in the square of Athens. If you have ever seen a respectable gentleman in a silk top hat lose his temper because a boy on the street dared to doubt the existence of ghosts, then you will understand the state of the noble founder of the academy. In his imagination, Plato already saw the tongues of flame greedily licking the letters off the parchment, turning the dangerous truth about atoms into a harmless cloud of smoke. The smell of old parchment and fresh beeswax in the academy library seemed to Plato saturated with heresy, and he squeezed his calamus with such frantic force that the poor reed made plaintive sounds, foretelling the death of an entire philosophical school. Here we should make a small stop and figure out why these two great minds, who never met in person and never exchanged a single living word, became such implacable enemies on the pages of history. Imagine Plato as the architect of a majestic heavenly palace. For him, the world was created by a great master according to ideal blueprints, where everything has its highest goal and divine meaning. In his universe, even an ordinary kitchen stool was only a pale shadow of some perfect idea of a stool dwelling somewhere in the transcendental heights. And then Democritus shows up to this shining feast of the spirit with his invisible particles. He enters this palace, starts picking at the gilding on the columns with his finger, and declares that there is no magic here, only an endless dance of dust motes in empty space. Only the intervention of two sensible Pythagoreans, Amyclas and Clinias, saved world history from an intellectual conflagration. They softly remarked to their teacher that burning these books was completely useless and even somewhat undignified for a man of his position. The ideas of Democritus by that time had already scattered throughout Hellas like those very particles the old man loved to discuss. Plato's hatred was so all-consuming that he decided on the most curious and yet cruel censorship in the history of literature. In all his endless dialogues, Plato never once allowed the letters of Democritus's name to desecrate his clean papyrus. It was a great silence, an attempt to pretend that such a person simply never existed in nature. Plato was deathly afraid of this imperturbable old man, his iron logic, and that very serenity that did not need gilded tales of a last judgment. If you expected to hear a sublime sermon from Democritus about an immortal spark that flies to the clouds after the body takes its last breath, then I hasten to disappoint or perhaps pleasantly surprise you with his complete lack of sentimentality. Our sage from Abdera believed that the human soul is not a misty ghost at all, but a quite tangible swarm of the smallest, round, and incredibly hot atoms that resemble the sparks of a fire and scatter in different directions as soon as the mechanism holding them together breaks. Imagine a venerable gentleman who looks at his neighbor not as the crown of creation, but as a very complex and rather fragile steam boiler, stuffed to the brim with tiny fireballs. For Democritus, life was a matter of pure mechanics and thermodynamics long before these words became fashionable among armchair scientists. To understand the audacity of this old man, it is worth looking at what the rest of the world believed while Democritus was counting his fireballs. In sunny Egypt, where Democritus wore out more than one pair of sandals in his youth, priests seriously believed that the soul is a whole set of spare parts. There was Ba in the form of a bird with a human head, and Ka, a kind of double that would get very upset if not fed a roast goose in the tomb. Even in Greece itself, the Orphics and Pythagoreans whispered that the body is a dark prison, and the soul is a divine prisoner. Against this background, Democritus looked like a sober engineer at a séance. He saw the soul as the most perfect form of matter. These fiery atoms, in his opinion, were the fastest and most mobile beings in the universe. Their constant collision inside our skull generates what we loftily call thought or feeling. The most curious thing in this theory is how Democritus explained the process of breathing, turning it into a kind of refueling. He believed that we are alive only as long as the air around us is full of these same fiery particles, and our lungs work like a tireless pump, pumping a fresh portion of life into the cooling body. Each breath is a recharge of our internal batteries, and each exhale is a loss of a piece of ourself, which flies away into the void to become part of a passing bird or a roadside stone tomorrow. While Persian Magi saw a deity in fire, Democritus saw in it simply the most efficient engine for human consciousness. He was not afraid of death because he understood, you cannot destroy what is part of an infinite movement. This view allowed him to meet old age with that legendary smile. The end of Democritus was like the final joke of an old master who knows exactly that there is nothing behind the curtain but silence, and therefore wants to leave to the accompaniment of the most earthly and cozy smell in the world. Death for him was not a tragedy, it was only the repayment of a debt to nature, and he paid this bill with such calmness as if he were simply about to move to the next room, having first refreshed himself with the spirit of fresh pastries. When the venerable elder turned 109 years old, an age at which an ordinary mortal would have already managed to forget his name 3 times and turn into a walking collection of complaints about the weather, he suddenly felt that his internal swarm of fiery atoms had begun to cool noticeably. It was as if the coal had suddenly run out in the most reliable steam engine in Greece. But at that very moment, his sister appeared on the threshold, in a state of extreme mental turmoil. The fact is that the great women's festival of Thesmophoria was approaching Abdera, and the prospect of a funeral in the midst of the celebration seemed to the philosopher's sister the height of indecency. To understand the scale of the disaster, the Thesmophoria was that very time when Greek women officially took a vacation from family slavery, took the keys to the city, and went to celebrate fertility in the company of Demeter and Persephone. For 3 days, the ladies lived in tents, observed strict fasts, and then with delight indulged in ritual foul language and sacrificed piglets to ensure the harvest for the next year. Democritus, who all his life preached proportionality and possessed the manners of a true gentleman, could not allow such tactlessness. He decided to stay in this world for another 3 days, but he did it not with the help of mournful prayers or dubious potions, but in a purely technical way, as befits an engineer of the universe. He asked to bring into his room huge woven baskets of freshly baked bread, still steaming with heat. Imagine this picture, a blinded elder, in whose body there is no more life than in a last year's cracker, sits in his bed surrounded by mountains of smoking pastries. He greedily inhaled the thick, warm aroma of wheat, which tickled his nostrils and, in his deep conviction, fed the fading flame of his soul. He believed that these smallest particles of smell, these invisible and incredibly active bread atoms, were able to temporarily patch the holes in his own energy field. As soon as the festivities in Abdera subsided and the ladies returned to their hearths, Democritus realized that his mission was accomplished. With a last deep breath, in which the taste of toasted wheat crust was still clearly felt, he allowed his fiery atoms to find their long-awaited freedom. We say goodbye to this great prankster of science, but in fact, he has not gone anywhere. His atoms are still here, participating in the eternal dance of life. As soon as the festive revelries in Abdera grew quiet and the ladies who were weary from their rituals and sacred foul language returned to their hearths, Democritus realized that his mission was complete. A funeral would no longer disturb anyone, for the proprieties had been observed and the baskets of bread had finally grown cold. With one last deep breath in which the distinct taste of a toasted wheat crust could still be felt, he allowed his fiery atoms to find their long-awaited freedom. A silence settled in the room, broken only by the steady rhythm of the Aegean Sea, but it was not a frightening emptiness. It was the solemn silence of a man who had lived 109 years and departed not by slamming the door but by quietly closing it behind him with a polite smile on his lips. We say goodbye to this great prankster of science, but in truth he has gone nowhere at all. Every time you inhale the morning air or feel the warmth of a sunbeam or look with curiosity at the machinery of this mad world, you are touching his legacy. His atoms are still here, participating in the eternal dance of life, building new worlds and quite possibly vibrating in your own thoughts right now, making you smile. The old man from Abdera was right after all, for nothing disappears without a trace. As long as matter exists, that same quiet and victorious joy of the mind will live on. He was the one who first dared to look into the abyss and see there not chaos but a strict and beautiful harmony of tiny particles.